Hej och välkomna till Samtal pågår. Jag heter Alexandra Frid.
Och jag heter Alexandra Härlitz.
Och idag ska vi återigen intervjua den amerikanska konsthistorikern Gail Levin som är professor i konst- och bildvetenskap på CUNY i New York. Vi kommer att intervjua henne om hennes senaste artikel som just handlar om Frida Kahlo.
Ni som har följt podden ett tag, ni kommer säkert ihåg att vi har pratat med Gail förut och det var i samband med Judy Chicago, för det var en annan kvinnlig konstnär som hon har beforskat. Så det ska bli väldigt kul att vi får presentera hennes nyaste forskning, kan man säga.
Precis. Okay, so with us we have Professor Gail Levin from New York, and you have just written an article about Frida Kahlo.
Yes, good morning. It's a different time zone in Sweden. Nice to speak with you both.
Okay, Gail, so I remember being your student in the 1990s in New York at Baruch College, and I remember that you incorporated Frida Kahlo in your lectures. But do you remember, well, about the time that you heard about Frida Kahlo for the first time and when you actually started to talk about her in your lectures?
You know, it's so many years ago, I can't be sure that it's the first time, but I can tell you the first time that I remember. And it's worth mentioning that Baruch College is part of the City University of New York, because before I was on the faculty there, when I was a curator at the Whitney Museum, I was a guest professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And that I can date. And I was thinking about it. That's when I first heard about Frida Kahlo. And I know exactly what the conversation was. It was with the late art historian, Linda Nochlin, who so championed women artists. And she was I was a guest professor there, and she was directing a dissertation by Hayden Herrera, whom Linda Nochlin mentioned had such a fascinating life story, which would eventually become Hayden Herrera's biography, 1983 biography. And Nochlin was just fascinated by Frida Kahlo's story, and I was hearing about it, and I believe I probably didn't hear that she was Jewish, but I definitely heard about Frida Kahlo being a fascinating life story at that moment. Well, I wasn't teaching full time until after I left the Whitney in 1984. And I was definitely interested in women artists. You remember by the time you were studying with me in the 1990s, but I was already interested in women artists at the Whitney. So I was looking into Edward Hopper's wife, Josephine Nivison Hopper, known as Jo Hopper. So I think by the time I began teaching at Baruch College of CUNY, City University of New York, in 1986, that I was already putting as many women artists as I could into my class lectures. And that must be when I began to include Frida Kahlo. I would learn much more about her as many publications by others came out.
Right. So, Gail, when we worked with the podcast on Frida Kahlo, we noticed that in the 1990s, there were a lot of scholars who started to focus on Frida Kahlo's ethnicity and her heritage much more than her biography. And what would you say? What is your opinion about that as a scholar who has written some of the most important biographies on women artists?
Well, you know, I think, and as my recent article shows, ethnicity is very interesting, but it's part of a whole political wave, not only in the United States, where we're coping with white nationalism right now and trying to deal with that, but it's been around if you go back to the early, to post-Civil War Reconstruction or the early 1930s. So this rears its ugly head every now and then. But Kahlo's biography, I think, is very important, as biography in general, I think, is important. But for Kahlo, I think it's more important than for many other artists, because of her remarkable ability to deal with her disabilities, her physical and medical disabilities. She and her biography are an inspiration for millions of people around the globe because of that. And I really think that the scholars who brought this out with the find, the bathroom at the Blue House where she lived with Diego Rivera was locked with many of her belongings for 50 years. And the recent scholars who at the Victoria and Albert and at the Blue House and at the Brooklyn Museum brought out the way she decorated her corsets, her medical corsets, to support her disabilities. Just the photos of her, painting, lying in bed, the way she refused to be stopped and daunted by her disability makes her biography one of the most significant.
We already touched upon your article, and we should also say what it is called. The name of the article is Frida Kahlos, Circulating Crafts, Her Painting and Her Invented Identities. So when you write about Kahlos' identities, is that something that you could tell us a little more about?
Kahlo featured in her artwork, certainly her identification with what was called Mexicanidad or Mexican identity. And she had one indigenous grandfather on her mother's side. Her mother was descended from Spanish settlers, but her mother was descended from Spanish on her maternal side, but on her mother's paternal side, it was native or indigenous people to Mexico. And Frida particularly identified with the Tehuana, the Zapotec people. So they're near Oaxaca, which is far south of Mexico City, where she grew up in really a suburb of Mexico City. So this is not really the culture she was surrounded by. But out of that cache of items in the bathroom that came out after 50 years was even a photograph. It's not discovered by me, by the way. I really want to pay homage to all the scholars and curators that worked on Frida Kahlo. But there is a photograph of her mother wearing the Tehuana costume. And so this was in Frida's family, but it happened that the Tehuana costume was perfect for covering up Frida's disabilities, the long, full skirts, because she had polio as a child, and she was in this tragic streetcar accident, breaking all kinds of bones and getting lifelong problems. So she could, by that part of her identity, cover up her disabilities. And I mean, she didn't want to go out in the world and be pitied. She wanted to go out in the world and, of course, be accepted. And her father, who was a German immigrant, she later tried to pass him off as Jewish. I'm not sure of exactly when we can precisely document that she did that. But the problem was, once you have the rise of Hitler and the Third Reich, you have both Jewish refugees from Germany and Eastern Europe and Mexico, and you also have Nazis taking refuge there, particularly after the war, after the defeat of the Third Reich. And it's quite clear that her father had nothing to do with the Nazis, and he dies during the war, but she didn't want anyone to imagine that since he was German, that he had anything to do with the Nazis. So that is part of her claiming his Jewish ethnicity, which I don't think will ever pan out to be true, as the recent German book on her father, who was a pretty eminent photographer, and they traced his genealogy. It appears to be all Lutheran. So that's...
If we talk a little bit further about her claiming to be Jewish, because we've talked about this before, Gail, but I think you have an interesting perspective on this because you told me that Diego Rivera was Jewish, right? On both sides.
Yes. So Diego Rivera didn't grow up as a Jew going to synagogue, but he grew up proud of his Jewish ancestry on both sides. And he identified it with his feisty social activism, his desire to go out and repair the world, which is tikkun olam in Hebrew. And so he spoke about it publicly, being descended from many things. One of his Jewish grandmothers was Portuguese. And so he talked about this and publicly and was very proud of it. So Frida, of course, had a very close and sometimes turbulent relationship with Diego, was very devoted to him. And I think him to her, actually. But Frida, I think, wanted to identify with whatever Diego was. And Frida's dealer in New York, Julian Levy, was Jewish. One of her important early collectors, Edwin G. Robinson, the actor, was Jewish.
Right.
These patrons in Mexico City were Jewish. And many of the people who bought out of her show at Julian Levy in New York were Jewish. So it's impossible to be in the 1930s in New York, or maybe even in Mexico City, with Jews living there and Hitler in Germany, and then during the war, and not be concerned and empathetic with their situation if you knew them. So that's what I think Frida's doing. I don't think she and Diego visited Detroit in 1931, 32, I believe. And Diego was being commissioned by Henry Ford and his son Edsel to paint the great murals that are today at the Detroit Institute of the Arts. And Frida was there with him. And they checked into a hotel which had a sign, no Jews, but their reservation was made by the Fords. And they checked in and said, "Good day, nice to meet you, we're Jewish." And then they asked Henry Ford's, reportedly, if he was Jewish, which he was a very well-known anti-Semite. So that was quite a thing to spring on him. But of course, Frida's Jewish identity, whether it's invented or not, she couldn't really paint it very easily in her paintings the way she could paint her Tijuana Mexican identity, because there weren't any real costumes for that would be recognizable or that would be applicable to a somewhat modern Jewish identity.
Because what you write about in your article is also her impact on Jewish artists today, but also in the past 30 or so years, right?
Yeah, now I recall that's how I discovered about Frida's Jewish identity. It was from actually the artist, Miriam Shapiro. And Alex, I believe I introduced you to her in one of your independent studies. So the feminist artist, Miriam Shapiro, must have read Hayden Herrera's biography, a really very popular biography of Frida Kahlo. And she was thrilled to learn for the first time that Frida Kahlo was Jewish. In fact, she was so enthusiastic, she told me about it. And she started putting Frida Kahlo images and images inspired by Frida Kahlo into her artworks. One called My History, which had a depiction of Frida's face, and Agony in the Garden, which relates to Frida's depiction of herself wearing her painted corset, and others. So this was something I never questioned. I took it quite seriously. And then there was the show at the Jewish Museum in 2003 in New York, curated by Gannett and Corey, who did a dissertation at Hebrew University, which really dealt with Frida Kahlo as a Jewish artist. And she did extraordinary work, but she believed that, and I think might still believe, that Frida's father was at least part Jewish. So there's the question to rule out, I suppose, of Frida Kahlo's father's mother. But I don't think there's any documentation that she really came from Arad, where Frida claimed her Jewish ancestors came from, which is today in Romania and was then in Hungary. When I went to the Jewish Museum, I just loved Anne Corey's Frida Kahlo show there in 2003. And it was reviewed by Grace Gluck, whom I knew, an art critic for the New York Times. She spoke about, anyway, Frida apparently inherited those awesome black eyebrows that almost met in the middle of her forehead. And I had those kinds of eyebrows as a young girl before tweezers. And I never thought of them as Jewish, and I'm Jewish. So I was fascinated that I shared this with Frida Kahlo. I don't think that heavy black eyebrows are particularly Jewish or Mexican. I think they just happen.
Yeah.
But at the time I felt, oh, wow, I've got something I share with Frida Kahlo. I think the most significant thing in my article is my explanation of why Vasily Kandinsky got so excited seeing Frida Kahlo and her work exhibited in Paris. And that takes me back to my own doctoral dissertation on Kandinsky and the American avant-garde. And Kandinsky, Russian artist working in and around Munich, took up painting on the back of glass, folk painting, Hinterglasmalerei. Mm-hmm. And that's the Mexican version of folk painting on the back of glass is the frame, the local Mexican craft frame that Frida purchased and put her painting, again, a Mexican craft, on metal, her self-portrait in that frame. And I think for Kandinsky, and tears supposedly ran down his cheeks, and I think it was being reminded of his own youth and his early love of the woman artist Gabriela Munter. And neither Diego Rivera nor Frida Kahlo nor any other scholar that I've heard of has made that connection. That, I think, might be the single discovery of my article.
That's really fascinating. Thank you so much.
I wish I knew Swedish and could listen to all the podcasts.
Thank you very much for joining us, Gail. It is always such a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me, and congratulations on these podcasts and their reception.
Det här var vår intervju med Gail Levin, och om ni är intresserade av att läsa hennes artikel så finns det faktiskt hennes bok eller artikeln gratis att läsa, så vi laddar upp en länk i bio så att ni kan läsa den om ni är intresserade.
Tack så mycket, hej då! Konsthistoriepodden görs med stöd av Gustav Adolf Bratts minnesfond och Göteborgs universitet. Manus och klippning görs av Alexandra Frid och Alexandra Herlitz.